William Deverell's acclaimed first novel, Needles, which drew on his experiences as a lawyer, won the $50,000 Seal Award. Since then, he has published 12 novels, including Trial of Passion, published in 1997, for which he won the prestigious Hammett Prize for Literary Excellence in Crime Writing, and his first Arthur Ellis Award for Best Crime Novel. He's the creator of the CBC series Street Legal. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Good to be here.
We're talking about writing the book that you'd like to read, and the fact that that is such good advice to writers. I heard Michael Connolly mention once that he writes about the things that scare him the most. Does that fit in with your approach?
Not really. I don't get scared easily, for one thing. I write the book that I enjoy and that I know my fans enjoy. And I get enormous amount of feedback in terms of emails mostly, but sometimes at readings. People tell me what they like about the book. They like the injection of humor I usually put in my books, for instance. And when I say I also write for myself, I'll sit there and start chuckling at something that comes to mind, talking to my characters, and they're talking back to me. I'm living in a community of people I love. I hope that's kind of reflected in the work I produce.
It's wonderful to be able to live in a parallel universe.
And to have created it yourself.
As a participant and as a god.
I hate to say this, but the people I hang around with all day, those people in my mind, tend to be slightly more interesting than the real people in the world. But of course, they have to be, or people wouldn't find the books interesting. I tend to be a bit of an iconoclast and a hermit, I suppose, when I'm surrounding myself with people of my own imagination and enjoying their company. Now I am carrying on a relationship with a protagonist through a series of recent novels. I've never done that before. And enjoying seeing how he develops and all the troubles he gets into and living his life. I never really thought I would ever create a serious character, even though every publisher I've ever worked with says you got to have a serious character if you're going to write within the crime genre. Mm-hmm. But until, I guess it was Trial of Passion, all my books had been what they call in the industry stand-alones. And now I have Arthur Beecham, spelled Beauchamp. It's an Anglicized, very, very common name in Britain. It looks as if it should be pronounced Beauchamp, and in French it is, but in England, if you look at the Oxford Dictionary, it's pronounced Beecham.
What I'd like to do with our time together is to look at that, exactly what you do when you write your books, your crime, mystery, literary mystery. Is that how you...
I like that expression. I mean, one of the prizes I most value is the Dashiell Hammett Award for literary excellence in that genre, which is a continent-wide award. And the other Canadian writer to win it is Margaret Atwood. Unfortunately, that doesn't take me out of the crime writing genre, and I'm not regarded as a literary writer. That's Canada for you. We do tend to ghettoize our writers.
Well, I think in the States too. Once you're labeled, it's difficult to get out of that.
Maybe so, but in the States they will lionize their crime writers, and you are the subject of studies in the New Yorker magazine and Harper's, whereas Canadian magazines tend to disregard. That's part of the Canadian culture. In Britain, of course, they knight their crime writers.
But what is it about Canadian culture then? Snobbish?
Yeah, there is that because we are a small country, and there was a kind of... It goes back, I think, several decades, right to the 1930s, when our libraries... They had a kind of popular fiction was put away in the corner, and we weren't supposed to really look at popular books that people actually enjoyed reading, because we were trying to build up a Canadian, not consciousness, but a Canadian sense of culture, and we concentrated on that rather than reading books for the pure thrill and joy of reading. And we got lost in that kind of snobbishness, and I suppose it's a kind of a colonial attitude that Canada suffered from.
It's almost like we're trying to be more British than the British.
Yes, but we would read the American British pulp stories like crazy, and That would be our escape if we wouldn't be caught dead reading. In terms of crime fiction, science fiction, other genres, Canada ended up slipping far behind the Americans, the Yanks and the Brits.
Just in terms of celebrating it.
Yeah, in terms of celebrating it, in terms of creating that kind of genre culture. We're slowly. I mean, when I first started writing novels, I think Needles came out in 1979. I don't think there were maybe more than one or two writers in Canada writing in that genre, thriller or crime fiction generally. And Needles was a pretty hard-boiled thriller that shocked the public. The reviews I got were, we don't do this in Canada. It's just, and, there was a fair bit of blood and gore in that book, more than any other since. I feel sort of responsible for shocking Canada into the fact that we can do this, we're allowed to do this, and we can enjoy reading books that have crime themes.
Let's get into specifically what makes it a crime mystery, literary mystery novel work. I'm just going to kind of run through some of the areas that I think make it work, starting with plot progression, series of reversals and recognitions, breakthroughs and catastrophes. The reader wants to know what will happen. And as an example, at the end of a chapter, one might write, "That night they dragged the river." End of chapter. Specifically, when it comes to reversals, recognitions, breakthroughs, do you do anything with that?
Well, I mean, that is a part and parcel of the crime book, but I pretty well organize my plot before I even write chapter 1, It Was a Dark and Stormy Night. I know how it's going to end, by and large. I build my reversals into my outline before I start writing. As many as I can. It's still an organic process, and as you write along, you come up with another idea. And
can you give us some examples of reversals? Big ones in your...
Well, I'll just go right back to Needles, my first novel. And this was written pre-computer, so on a typewriter, where you have to write a clean page every time. Well, my protagonist in that book originally was an alcoholic prosecutor who was prosecuting a serial killer who was involved in the heroin smuggling in Vancouver's East End and throughout British Columbia, a very, very wealthy man. And halfway through that book, I realized, hey, it's going to make it a lot more interesting for the reader if my protagonist, instead of being a prosecutor who is a drunk, is a prosecutor who is a heroin addict himself. Mm-hmm. And then you have that relationship between the pusher and the junkie who happens to be the hero of the book, and he's grappling with his addiction. You have to rewrite the first half of that book to make that work. And so, that is a kind of, I don't know if you call it a reversal. It was a reversal for me. But that's an example of,
Does that come out right at the beginning, or does his habit come out?
Chapter 3.
When you mentioned that, I was immediately reminded of the governor of New York,
Yeah,
Spitzer,
yeah.
who kind of clamped down on prostitution, and yet here he was a frequenter of a brothel.
Yeah. My character is a lot more sympathetic than Spitzer. But I'm writing a book about politicians right now.
Good. That's part of the series, right?
Yes, the Arthur Beecham series. The one that's just come out, Kill All the Judges, is a sequel to April Fool.
And that won the Ellis.
That won the Arthur Ellis Award, Best Crime Fiction. The next book, as yet untitled, but I'm working on it, but it's set in Ottawa, is a sequel to this one, To Kill All the Judges. And the reason for it being set in Ottawa is that in the course of my creating my protagonist, Arthur Beecham, and his relationship with his ecologist neighbor, then wife, Kill All the Judges have been married several years. She's a tree hugger, a tree sitter, a demonstrator, and he's a bit of a conservative old fart, and there's a dynamic there that works very well. And in this book, Kill All the Judges, she is... That's not the main story. The side story is that she's running for Parliament for the Green Party, hoping, and ultimately, obviously, gets elected so I can set my next book in Ottawa. Arthur Beecham has to be dragged kicking and screaming to Ottawa. He hates the thought of it. Politicians, the weather, the whatnot. And so I'm having a lot of fun with that one.
Yes, it's sort of opposites attract.
In character, that's very important, it seems to me, to create a dynamic between characters who may even love each other, but pull in different directions. And, I've done that with most of my relationships throughout my books. Well, we were talking about the dance of Shiva, and the lawyer in that case has quite a tug and a pull with his partner and so forth. Maybe that's because I've enjoyed the same relationship with my wife over the years. But one has to create conflict, even if it's friendly conflict, in almost every genre of literature.
One of the things that often works better is, instead of having right and wrong going up against each other, having right and right going up against each other. You ever experimented with that?
Two versions of rightness. Well, that's what politics is all about, isn't it? You've got various political parties who believe they are doing the right thing, and I have in the book I'm working on right now, a prime minister and an opposition party leader and a Green Party leader who all really believe in the positions they take and the philosophy they hold, and they're in vast conflict. So yeah, that's entirely workable. And in my courtroom scenes in various books, one has a prosecutor who really believes in the rightness of his or her cause, and the defense counsel who takes an opposite position.
And hopefully believes in the rightness of their cause.
Obviously, or should. I mean, any lawyer worth his salt has got to believe in that he or she's doing the right thing.
Moving along with the plot here, incompletions that imply later completion, questions that are eventually answered, dangers proceeding to safety or disaster. Examples of that in your work?
Well, I don't know if I follow a formula that would comprise those various techniques that I'm sure are common to many crime books. I do love to play around with those recipes in a different way. I've done so with a couple of books, Kill All the Lawyers and Kill All the Judges, in which I have a lawyer who's trying to write his own mystery book. He does so in Kill All the Lawyers. He is following a kind of recipe from a book called How to Write a Whodunit.
This is fiction within fiction.
This is fiction within fiction. And the fiction that my character is writing echoes the actual story. And here, this is, for instance, and this is a very early page of Kill All the Judges. In one typeface, I include his effort at a first chapter, and then we go into my description of his struggle to write this. If you don't mind my just reading this paragraph. As Brian reread that ghastly paragraph, he felt a Pavlovian shock, the kind administered to a rat making a wrong turn in the maze. Ever since he'd installed Horace Widgeon's program on his hard drive, Secrets of the Whodunit, 5998, he'd been getting these little jolts, not painful but persistent. The sensible part of him believed there was a short circuit somewhere in his ugly, glowing purple EMAC. In his fantasies, he imagined Widgeon was pressing a Zap Pomeroy button on a supercomputer in his cottage in the Cotswolds. Yes, Brian had mocked the legendary creator of the Inspector Grudgeon series, his mentor from afar. In the section titled, The Author as Soothsayer, Widgeon instructs, Do not predict. I find myself forever in despair that so many beginners subscribe to the little did he know school of composition. Let this historic and holy injunction be your guiding light. Just the facts, ma'am. And that is, so I run that kind of theme throughout the book. When I first introduced Hector Widgeon and his Art of the Whodunit in Kill All the Lawyers, I was getting questions at various readings or from emails. Where can I buy a copy of Mr. Widgeon's book? So,
so many writers do that. I know that what's his name, Dean Koontz, wrote How to Write a Bestseller.
Yeah. Yeah, and so anyway, so I have created all my own little injunctions and pieces of advice.
But
Most of which are
fun? Are you poking fun?
Yeah, I'm poking fun, but at the same time, the advice is usually pretty good. You know, it's reliable advice. If you want to write a stock mystery, a stock whodunit.
And what is the advice then?
Well, you come up with a good plot, a strong character. You have to build your various twists into it and prepare the reader for a shocking end. Yet satisfy him. You've got to satisfy the reader. He's got to have a tummy-filling sense of completion at the end of the book, and essentially that's it. That's a kind of standard recipe for a standard whodunit. But you've got to get beyond that. That's the thing about writing books within that genre.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if it was easily done by simply picking up a how-to book, then everyone would be doing it.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to get at here.
I have to say this, that, the vast majority of books written in that genre seem to have come out of that kind of cookie-cutter, how to write a whodunit mold. And I've read so many, and I've been a judge in lots of fiction contests involving crime books. It's as if they've sat down with how to write a whodunit and followed almost mercilessly the pattern set out for them.
But what makes yours different then?
Well, first of all, I do inject a lot of humor, and I do that because I just enjoy humor. And a lot of books, I'd say by far the majority of say mysteries, crime books, do not inject humor. I mean, humor. Yeah, people love to sit around and chuckle and then be maybe stirred a little bit. I invest my characters with character. I do try to create rounded, interesting, unique, sometimes bizarre characters, but believable. People who are credible. Again, a lot of mystery books don't do that.
There's one thing about the antagonist. You have to build a character that's worth going after, that's interesting and complicated, but who makes all of the effort that the protagonist is going through to get
worthwhile
and believable, as you say.
Yeah, or the groups of antagonists. Yeah. Sometimes it's not. You don't really, at least in my work, you don't necessarily have just an antagonist. It's not. You're not pitting hero versus villain. It is simply an effort to save a client from the system. That is being wrongfully accused and wrongfully prosecuted and by the court system. So there may not be one single bad guy, but the judge might be a bit of an asshole, and the prosecutor might be going for the throat too much and that sort of thing. But a good thriller or a mystery shouldn't necessarily just have to have a good guy, bad guy situation. And your good guy's got to be flawed, properly flawed. He cannot be just your typical cynical private eye, with his bottle of whiskey in his drawer, sort of thing. That typecast hero.
I suppose that might have worked with Dashiell Hammett.
Worked back then because these were the original creators.
Now they're caricatures.
Yes, very much so. I mean, worked back when they were created, but then everyone sort of jumps in and follows that model. My Arthur Beecham is a kind of a failed human being. That's what people really they can identify with a guy he's an alcoholic. He has sexual problems. He can't get it up half the time. He's full of self-doubt, classically educated, hates the courtroom, but he's great in the courtroom, that sort of thing. And a great book within that genre has to have that kind of complexity of character to work. And that, as you ask me, what do I think makes my books stand out, if they stand out, is I think mainly that is the character creation process.
The humor and the
complexity. Yeah, the depth of character. And proud of my twists. I love the big surprise ending. Love to play with the reader.
Asking the how, what, when, why continually, and then satisfying them as you go along?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know about the what. The how is important in many cases. The who is ultimately important in a whodunit. I'd say that half of my novels are kind of courtroom dramas, and so it's the big question is the what. What is the verdict going to be? Or how? How does Arthur get him off? Or in the case where my protagonist is a prosecutor, how does he get this bad guy? And I do have the advantage of having been a criminal lawyer for many, many years, and so I know how the system works.
And you must have gotten some pretty decent stories from the real world.
Well, obviously. Yeah. But as a result, there's a verisimilitude to my courtroom scenes. They do, I hope, seem natural, because I've been there. I know what I'm talking about, and I've had, as a defense lawyer, all sorts of junkies and hookers and, dealers and fraud artists and bunco artists. So I know these people, and I can incorporate them much more easily into my books than most writers who haven't had the advantage of that experience.
The other successful crime writers are, as you say, the ones who have been involved in the process in the real world. I'm thinking of police officer James O'Bourne as someone who's...
Yeah, or crime reporter.
Yeah.
Conway was one, yeah. It really helps having that kind of background.
I want to talk about time here. Do you use the Batman approach? We've only got a limited amount of time to achieve a certain task.
That's called the clock. You're working on a clock.
Yeah.
It's a TV series, 24 Hours is called. You've got, before the bomb goes off, I've done that in a number of books. It keeps the reader glued. Sometimes it doesn't work within the context of a novel. I usually have a situation where you are trying to beat a deadline, or you're running up against the clock, and Arthur Beecham and Kill All the Judges, for instance, has been resisting taking on this defense of this poet who's accused of murdering a judge, until the very last minute, when the original lawyer, who was this guy trying to write the book, has a total nervous collapse in the courtroom, and he's suddenly thrust into this thing with 3 days preparation to get ready for this trial. And so he's got to deal with the clock there. He's got the judge who's rushing him through it and that sort of thing. So you can play with the clock in different ways. You have, in one of my novels, Mecca, I have an explosion that's going to occur within a certain amount of time, and you've got to beat that clock. You've got to rescue these people within that time. So it's a device that works within the context of a certain kind of plot, but maybe not others.
What's the certain kind of plot?
A plot where you've got to do something within a certain amount of time to resolve a situation. When you're dealing with a trial will kind of plot on at its own pace. And,
some of them can take years.
Yeah, mine never do.
Yeah. I want to quote or misquote Chekhov. Chekhov talked about a gun. If you see a gun on the wall in the first act, then it must discharge in the third. Do you hang any guns on walls early on?
I think that may be truer of a play than it would be of a novel. In a play, you have maybe 3 acts, in total 2 hours to do something with that gun. I don't think that's necessarily true of a novel.
Maybe metaphorically, though.
But metaphorically, if you set up a situation in an early chapter and you spend some time with it, the reader is going to feel cheated unless that situation is resolved at some point. Why did this writer, talk about having to get tickets to travel to Timbuktu? He never goes to Timbuktu.
Yeah, you're irritated.
Yeah. So, but I'll do that. I'll set something up, but I'll make damn sure the reader isn't cheated.
Yeah.
That situation is resolved, and it's very, very meaningful. When somebody reads something that seems a little bit out of context within the novel early on, I want that reader to know, and if he's read me before, he or she will know that is of some significance, and they'll keep it in their mind.
That you're not putting things in gratuitously.
Yeah.
There's a great line, Borges' line about every detail is an omen and a cause.
That's a good line. Yeah. At least an omen. Details are there for a reason. I do not like to read, detailed descriptions of place or a scene in a room unless it is setting something up in my mind that's important for what comes later. Some significant details, like a piece of statuary, or the phone keeps ringing and nobody answers, something like that.
Or an empty chair.
Yeah. But there has to be payoff.
Now that we're quoting famous authors, in Oedipus, the messenger from the past, and the news that causes a reversal or a reappraisal of you. You use that sort of technique, or a discovery that someone is someone that you didn't realize to be.
Oh, well, it is. That sounds almost a little occultish, but as you will recall from the dance of Shiva, Shiva, who is this guru-like figure, is in fact sending messages to the lawyer who's defending him on this murder that are messages that seem to come out of nowhere and mysteriously. And I don't often work within areas that are not really kind of fact-based and
well, for example, let's say someone finds out that they're not the offspring of the person that they thought they were.
Yeah, I've worked that theme in a book called Slander. The hero is a young woman lawyer, civil rights lawyer, who was adopted, but only discovers this in the course of a long battle with a judge. She's accused of raping her. And so, that is... I've done a lot of work in that.
Yeah. And again, that the reader, along with the character, is surprised.
The reader had better be, because the character drags the reader along with her, and the character, in a sense, becomes the reader. If you've created a strong character, the reader will identify with that character and be her, be him. So we'll share the surprise or the exaltation or the despair.
Yeah, or the go through the crisis and experience that transformation.
Yes, yeah. Then when that happens, you've been successful as a writer.
And you know that because you get feedback from the readers.
I do. I get loads of emails. That being the form of transmission of views that is de rigueur today. Especially after a book comes out, I know I'll get a flood of emails. Usually more when the paperback comes out in a year's time, but the paperbacks outsell the hardcovers 10 to 1. But the more perspicacious reader will buy the hardcover, especially my hardcore fans. Some of them just love to not only say, "Oh, there's a wonderful book," but on page 432. You mentioned Slater Street meets with whatever, and so it doesn't. Yeah, they love to do that.
But then you tell them, "Wait a minute, this is fiction."
No, you can't get away with that because I am particularly take great pride in being accurate, particularly with my geographical locations and so forth. So I got a letter from a weatherman complaining about how I described a front coming in, for instance, So you wouldn't believe the stuff you have to research. Writers dread and should dread getting that kind of email.
It's funny though because I read somewhere that Wayne Johnston, the Newfoundland author, did exactly what you King Street met up with John Street, and it doesn't in the real world. But his defense was that it just sounded much more poetic the way that he had composed it, and so he didn't feel like he had to justify it.
I think that's a pretty weak defense. You could come up with another 2 streets to sound even more poetic and get away with it. But it is fiction. But I still you can be forgiven the odd typo because it's not your fault. That's the copy editor's fault. Get the year wrong or something and happens, but you've got to try to avoid those things because one little glitchy thing And you can turn a reader away from you.
Yeah, you sort of undermine the contract.
Yeah,
or,
that's right. The contract you have with your reader.
Yeah. Speaking of which, suspense has been described as being created by promises made and kept.
Promises made and kept or not kept, I should think. I don't.
Well, waiting for the second shoe to drop. Foreshadowing and climax.
Mm-hmm.
As you said before, you make a habit of making sure that you do keep the promise, or you do, if you're going to put a detail in, then you're going to explain
there's one exception to that, when one might not drop the other shoe in the course of a book. That is if you are writing a series. My last novel, April Fool, ends with an unresolved question. Will Arthur, in his appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, save this beautiful area from being clear-cut by developers? That's left up in the air and resolved in the next book.
Oh, yes, okay. Again, like Batman, the next episode.
Yeah, that's right. And that is a technique I've only resorted to using since I've created this series character, of course.
Which allows you to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so to be continued.
Well, in a sense, but you don't. Your main story, of course, you've got to resolve. But a side story, such as the environmental story in April Fool, maybe 15% of the book. So you can leave the reader hanging on that one.
What about seduction? If there's an attractive woman that shows up early on that one of your characters has an interest in, that's a pretty good way of keeping readers interested, whether or not he's going to successfully seduce her or not, or vice versa.
Well, I don't know if it should be an issue of seduction, but a little less basic, just romance, or whether there is a coming together affectionately between people. I've often worked from not the opposite premise, but a different premise, a couple that are together, struggling through a relationship as the book progresses, maybe breaking apart or not being able to resolve. And I've done that through several novels when I think about it, and including The Dance of Shiva, Mind Games, which is a couple of books ago. The protagonist, who's a forensic shrink, breaking up with his wife at the beginning of the book and struggling through that throughout, and I have Arthur Beecham struggling with his relationship with his eco-sensitive environmentalist wife constantly through books.
But how does that keep the reader turning the page?
They wonder because they love both these people, they want the relationship to work. They want them to resolve their difficulties. It's a situation far more readers can identify with than the simple seduction of one person of another. Most readers are mature, have been through relationships, are struggling through relationships, and they can say, "What, God, Arthur, why don't you bring her flowers?" Or what, that sort of thing, Or Margaret, why are you so stubborn about this? And for me, anyway, that works better than a simple, are they going to end up in bed together kind of scenario.
Can you give us some examples of foreshadowing that you would have used?
Of what kind of?
Well, I think of Macbeth and the witches.
Oh. Setting up an atmosphere that would...
Setting up an atmosphere, or planting a seed, or...
Let me think. All right. Obviously, lots of examples, and if I just use my current book, kill all the judges for that. We have Brian Pomeroy, this lawyer who obsessively wants to write and publish a whodunit. In the course of his writing it, he is clearly foreshadowing events, in the portions of his manuscript that I quote from. He's clearly foreshadowing events that will occur, but occur in a slightly different way than he...
In the real world.
Yeah. In reality. I love that technique of the book within the book, and the reader wonders, well, is this actually going to happen? Or, and then a technique that allows you all sorts of areas for built-in twists and surprises.
The beginning of Farewell to Arms starts off, the leaves fell early that year, foreshadowing early death. Do you ever go with that kind of metaphor?
Probably not. I don't consciously open a book with any kind of sense of how the book may conclude or develop in that way. I'm not one of those persons, I love that line, but I'm not one of those persons who will spend days, weeks, months on an opening sentence to a book. I just like to kick in and get something going.
You don't, for example, you wouldn't use seasons to...
Or it was a dark and stormy night, which is the ultimate kind of cliche in foreshadowing, you know.
Yeah, we talked a bit about withholding revelation, or doling out or gradually unraveling the story. For example, a woman she may be very beautiful, but she's not married. And maybe a bit later on you find out that, she's been left by a lover, and that lover was killed in a war or something.
Well, I think in a mystery book, you can't avoid doing that, especially you're creating a mystery, so you cannot give everything away about a person. If it is a whodunit or even a trial drama, a courtroom drama such as mine, you have to slowly paint a picture of a person who might be the ultimate culprit, the black hat. You cannot give everything away. And even with your hero, you want to just slowly paint a picture. Wait till you're about chapter 3 or 4 before you maybe give away a very important clue as to whatever trauma or neurosis that he or she may be suffering from. Chapter 4, you find that the person walks up 5 flights of stairs before he'll take an elevator, for instance, you see. Yeah. And now you understand why he seems a little bit neurotic earlier on.
You changed somewhat your focus when you wrote Trial of Passion. Are you trying to escape this genre, or
I guess that really says it fairly bluntly.
And perhaps you could talk about the differences and why you
Trial of Passion, and then was followed, I think, by Slander, and even the Laughing Falcon. I didn't kill anyone off.
You're getting, in your old age, you're
well,
it's
just
losing your bloodthirsty.
No, I was in fact trying to escape the chains and the bindings of the crime genre.
Yeah.
And with Trial of Passion, and there was definitely a crime or alleged crime. It was a rape. It was a kind of allegedly sadomasochistic encounter between a law professor and a student, but without any great violence. I thought, okay, here finally is a book that is more literary than crime. It's a relationship book, and I hoped that would break me out of the genre ghetto. And it ended up winning me 2 prizes for crime books. The Arthur Ellis Award in Canada and the North American Dashiell Hammett Award for literary excellence in crime books. And
kind of ironic.
And it did. And so what it told me is they weren't going to let me go. They weren't going to let me leave. The people who judge these things, they saw me trying to wiggle away, and they weren't going to let me. And I kept trying with Slander and with the Laughing Falcon.
But surely you could write a novel that has absolutely nothing to do with crime.
Well, I suppose I could. I mean, I'm writing from my strengths as a former criminal lawyer, right? I was a journalist before that. I could. Would I write as good a book if I were to do that? If I were to write...
What you're trying to find out yourself.
Would I write do I want to write a kind of typically Canadian book about the trauma of a young man growing up in the prairies with acne on his face? It does not seem to me the sort of book that would entertain me. or my fans, and I don't want to disappoint them. So I'm not going to kind of make the big jump and write some tedious but allegedly a piece of literature just to say I can do it. I might well. If I can get the right story. It's still going to be it would still have to be full of drama. It would still have to be full of twists, and it would still have to be
contain all of the elements that make it a page turner and something that's going to appeal to readers.
Yeah, and it will probably still be set in the crime section of the bookstores because I'm there, and it just seems there is no escape. But fair enough. At least as I mentioned to you, I got the odd complaint from especially American publishers. This book is too literary for the genre, and they don't want to put me outside the genre. But if I can elevate the genre to a level of high literate content, I'm happy to do that.
You see, the crime novel that I think is the greatest that's ever been written is Crime and Punishment, and yet no one puts that in the crime genre section.
Yes, and it's the first also psychological crime thriller, and Raskolnikov with his tortured self, who becomes the victim of his own crime. You're right, it's still almost an unbeatable crime novel. There have been lots of writers who've written crime-oriented books who simply will never be thrust into that genre. But you'll never find Crime and Punishment in the criminal bookshelves, the libraries, or the bookstores. Bookstores need to do that.
They don't. Yeah, they need to know where to put stuff. And your readers know where to need to know where to find you.
Hopefully, they will find me in 2 or 3 different sections of a bookstore. But by and large, they'll know they can find me in the crime section.
And they can find you on the internet too. You have your own website.
www.deverell.com. It's pretty easy to find. Easily Googled as well. So I'm all over the joint there.
And they can rent your fabulous villa down in Costa Rica. Yeah,
I've got a little link to that on my website. I try to spend as much time down there as possible, but sometimes it's hard. Book coming out this month. I've got to be in Canada.
At least it's not December or February.
Well,
I guess you were here, though.
I was here in February. So we try to keep it occupied and try to. I encourage writers. I give 15% reduction to anybody who writes or is a member of any kind of like reading club and that sort of thing. Artists, ecologists, environmentalists. Don't make any money writing it out, but I keep it occupied. The house is ready for us when we get down there.
Just finally, have you achieved what you wanted to achieve in your life and in your writing?
Well, in my life, probably not, but my life has changed. There was a point in my life where I wanted to be Prime Minister of Canada. I ran for Parliament a couple of times. And there was a point in my life I wanted to edit a newspaper. But all those dreams kind of paled under the one lofty goal of being a writer that I had since I can't remember, a teenager. I was going through my effort at a journal when I was 14 years old one time, and that's in my archives now at the University of Saskatchewan. Just an old kind of most chewed scrapbook it was, and I had written this pompous 14-year-old phrase, "I am going to be a great writer one day." And it is, and
gotta write it down to make it happen.
And I did write it down, and then and then there's this long interregnum where it never happened, and it never happened, and I didn't believe it was going to happen, and I became a lawyer instead because I could make that happen. Mm-hmm. How many chances does someone get to be a writer who actually sells books and can make a living out of it?
Especially in Canada.
So I just put that aside, but the dream wouldn't go away. I think I was about 39 years old when I dragged it out of the closet, dusted it off, and said, "I'm taking off," and went off to the Gulf Islands and wrote needles. Won $50,000 for that book.
That's amazing.
Never turned back.
I remember back. That is an extraordinary. They still get that award.
No.
That was extraordinary.
Yeah, it was to me too. I mean, it was like, I got this letter. You have won. Please come to Toronto and pick up your $50,000. And I thought, holy crow! And that, of course,
pretty good endorsement.
I would say, and I feel so sorry for the thousands who have to sort of work their way slowly up. They might get a short story in Prism magazine or here and there, and finally. So I was very, very lucky.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking to us.
I enjoyed.
William Deverell is an acclaimed novelist who has won the Arthur Ellis Award 2 times and the Dashiell Hammett Prize for Literary Excellence in Crime Writing. Thanks again.
You're welcome.